Well, Mr. Nell, where are we now?
Well, right now, this is a display of the Allied weapons we have from Great Britain and from the Soviet Union. The most common British rifles used by the British Royal Army and Royal Marines were these Lee Enfield bolt-action rifles. They were introduced in service in 1895. They first saw service during the Boer conflict against South African guerrillas in 1899 during the turn of the 20th century. They had two models. They had the standard Lee Enfield here that fired a 303 round. That's similar to the Japanese Type 99. It was fed by the tactical 10-round box magazine. And they had this carbine version here that came out later in the war. It's called the short magazine Lee Enfield, SMLE acronym. A lot of troops called it SMELLY for short. The carbine was used a lot of times in the jungle fighting during the China-Burma-India theater, especially when the 14th Army was fighting against the Japanese. And it served from 1895 till 1957 until it was replaced by the Belgian-made FN FAL, Fabrique Nationale Fusil Automatique La Guerre. It was a select fire rifle, fired both semi-automatic and full automatic, similar to the Sturmgewehr, which was also select fire, which fired both semi and full automatic. Now, the bottom here were the common Soviet weapons known as the Mosin Nagant. Like the Lee Enfield, it was developed during the late 19th century, the late 1800s, around 1891 or so. And again, it saw service until it was replaced by the AK-47 in the late 40s and early 50s. Fired a 7.62 by 54 millimeter round. And some people think, well, is that the same as 308 NATO? Says no, 308 NATO is 7.62 by 51 millimeter. It was used as both a battle rifle and a sniper rifle as well by the Soviet forces. In fact, the top scoring Soviet sniper ace, Vasily Zaitsev, used a Mosin Nagant rifle during the fighting in the Eastern Front. The top sniper in the world is a Finnish sniper. I can't pronounce his name, but during the Winter War of 1939-1940, when Finland was fighting the Soviet Union for 3 months, he also carried both a Russian design and a Finnish design Mosin Nagant rifle, and in the 100 days of fighting, scored over 500 kills against the Soviet invaders.
Wow. Well, I guess I have to ask, I'm stumbling, did he have a scope on that, or was he using open sights?
Well, Vasily Zaitsev used a scope. It was a low-powered 1.5 by 2 powered PU scope. Simo Hayahe, if I pronounced the Finnish sniper right, he did not use a scope. The reason why he did not use a scope is he was afraid that the glint from the lens, if the sunlight glanced off the lens, he was afraid the reflection might give him away to a Soviet sniper who might be sitting there hunting him down. So Zaitsev used a scope, it was a low-powered scope, whereas Simo Hayahe used standard iron sights.
All right. Well, I gather that's it for our Allied troops. Now, how about our Americans?
Okay, well, let's go over here.
All right. All right, so now we're at the American weapons section.
Well, here we are. This is just a small representation of the American weaponry that was carried by our GIs and Marines. On the top here, you have two models of the Thompson submachine gun that was invented by Brigadier General John Thompson. Had World War I had gone into 1919 to maybe up to the early 20s, John Thompson was hoping that these weapons would be used as trench sweepers against the German forces. But it wasn't developed in time for that. So the war ended in 1918 before Thompson managed to get his weapons in the hands of Allied forces. The two models here, for example, this one on the other, this model here, well, the one on the other side you see with a drum magazine. It's a 1921 model. The 1921 model could be fed by both 20, 30 round regular stick magazines or 1,500 round drum magazines. And to know the difference between the 21 model, you see the forward hand grip on the front.
Yeah.
Okay. These weapons,
And then you have the vertical.
right? This one here, just a regular regular handguard. This is the 1928 model, and you can notice too, the flash suppressor is different from that model and this model. Like the 21 model, the 28 model can be fed by stick magazines or drums. The trouble with drum magazines is they're very unreliable. It causes a lot of stoppages, not only from the 1921 Thompson, but the Russian Peppershot 41 submachine gun, and its Finnish copy, the Suomi, also had these drum magazines that held like 70 rounds, but they were prone to a lot of jamming, and drum magazines are very difficult and complicated to reload. The latter version of the Thompson submachine gun came about later in the war, known as the M1. A lot of weapons, American designations, have been given the M1 designator. The M1 version, the charging handle, instead of on top, was on the right-hand side. It did not have this ribbed barrel to it. It had a regular straight handguard, and it can only be fed by 20 and 30 round box magazines. The bottom here, a facsimile. This is a facsimile. Again, these are all facsimiles. This is a facsimile of the M1 Garand, invented by John C. Garand, a Canadian-American inventor. It was also an engineer. This is the rifle that General George Patton called the greatest battle implement ever devised. It fired a 30-06 caliber round. It was fed by this, what's called an N-block clip. It is an 8-round N-block clip. More than 5 million of these M1 Garands were made during the Second World War. Now, contrary to popular belief, even though a lot of GIs and Marines were equipped with it, the difference between this and other semi-automatic rifles like the SVT-40 that the Soviet Union had, the German Gewehr 41 and 43, this was standard issue, whereas the SVT-40, the G41 and G43 were issued only to special purpose troops. Like the Sturmgewehr, it was only issued to special purpose troops.
I have a question. My Uncle Richard, he's passed away, but he used to say that a lot of the privates had, in boot camp, had the M1 thumb. What was that?
The M1 thumb is, well, when the last round is fired, the bolt slides back and locks into position. And then the end block clip, it flips out. So what happens is when you reload the end block clip into the very top, you've got to be very careful, because if you push down and not careful enough, the charging handle will go forward, and sometimes your thumb gets stuck on the bolt while it's trying to go in the battery.
And I gather that stings.
That stings.
Thank you.
And then another rifle here. This is the M1 carbine. This is the M1 carbine. Contrary to popular belief, it is not a carbine version of the M1 Garand. Though it's 30 caliber, it is not the same 30-06 caliber as the M1 Garand. This fires like the Sturmgewehr, an intermediate cartridge, 7.62 by 33. This was supposedly originally developed for people who are not gunfighters, not in the infantry, for tank crew, artillery crew, radio men, or signalers, as the British and Commonwealth forces call them, cooks, bakers, clerks. That way, instead of having just a standard 1911-45, you have this lightweight M1 carbine. Later on, when the infantry saw that, hey, we like this carbine, it's light, has a decent muzzle velocity of up to 2,000 feet per second, has a good effective range of up to 275 meters or 300 yards. And the 15-round magazines, it's easy to load and easy to reload on the M1 carbine. In fact, this was the favorite captured American weapon that the Germans like to use.
Wow.
And I mean, the M1 carbine has its detractors, but it has a lot of good points to it. The carbine, believe it or not, was actually the most widely produced shoulder-fired weapon in the entire Second World War. People think it's the M1 Garand. No. 5.5 million M1 Garands were made. Over 6 million carbines were made. So, and then another thing a lot of gun people think, that, well, the M1 carbine influenced the Ruger Mini 14 that came out in the 1970s. No, it didn't. In fact, it's the M1 Garand. If it wasn't for the M1 Garand, you wouldn't have the AK-47, you wouldn't have the M14, and you wouldn't have the Ruger Mini 14. In fact, when I said earlier about the Sturmgewehr that Mikhail Kalashnikov said that he was, later on admitted he was influenced by it, he actually took the gas operating system of the M1 Garand and put it into the AK-47, only upside down.
Wow, okay. My Uncle Richard, I have pictures of him on his Stuart tank with a grease gun on his side.
Yes. We have a facsimile here of the M3 submachine gun, obviously called the grease gun for obvious reason. It looked like a mechanic's tool. The United States forces, when they saw the British using these Sten guns, these cheap $12 Sten guns made of stamped steel and tubing, and it was a very effective weapon, well, the M1 Thompsons were very expensive to make, upwards up, and even back then, $250 to make a Thompson, it's like $4,000 today. They needed a submachine gun that was cheaper to make and mass produce. So they were influenced by the British Sten gun. And then they came up with the M3 submachine gun. Later on, there was an M3A1 version. The difference between the two is the M3, if you see the charging handle, it looks like a lever device, like a cranking lever. Well, there were some problems with that. If some troops get hung up on vines, wire, or whatever, and it's easily damaged. So later on, the M3A1 was developed. It didn't see much action in the Second World War, but it did see some action during the Korean and Vietnam War in the hands of recon teams from MACV-SOG. The M3A1, instead of that cranking lever device, when you open the dust cover on it, on the bolt, there's a divot in it where you take your finger and use that to charge the weapon, to cock the weapon. The M3, even though it was declared obsolete by 1959, it went on to serve in Vietnam with these units known as MACV-SOG. They had an integral silencer or suppressor, and in the close quarter jungle fightings of Vietnam, it was very ideal in close quarter combat. And then, in fact, the grease gun would also become one of the first weapons adopted by the Delta Force in 1977, 1978. It went on to serve actually well into the 90s in the first Gulf War, used by tanker troops, by tanker crew. They use it basically, tankers are not known to be gunfighters, they're not infantrymen. So if your tank gets knocked out, what you do with your grease gun or your carbine, you use it to break contact with the enemy. You're not there to have a stand-up fight, you're not an infantryman.
All right. Well, does that conclude our World War II weapons room?
I believe so. That pretty much covers, again, this is just a small percentage of what troops use in both Allied and Axis forces used in World War II.
Well, I'd like to say thank you very much for letting me come back and make this video with you. A lot of people mentioned that I didn't have you do this prior to the last time, but we only have so much time. So thank you again, and we are at the Maryland Veterans Museum at Patriot Park, Newburgh, Maryland.